Could America invade Iran? The consequences, in truth, nobody wants to say. What would really happen if American troops were sent onto the ground in Iran? On paper, the United States has the strongest military in the world. More aircraft, more technology, and a far larger defense budget. But a ground war inside Iran would be a completely different story. Experts say it could become one of the most difficult military operations in modern history. Iran is nearly 4 times the size of Iraq, with a much larger population, rugged mountains, vast deserts, and cities built deep inside defensible terrain. Any invasion would require an enormous number of troops, massive supply lines, and long-term commitment that could rival or exceed past wars like Vietnam or Iraq. Iran also has one of the largest militaries in the Middle East, along with millions of reservists and militia fighters who could turn the conflict into a long, grinding war of resistance. Even if the U.S. wins battles early, holding the country would be far harder than entering it. So the real question isn't whether America could fight Iran. It's whether any nation could truly control it after the fight begins. If war ever reached that point, the world will be watching one of the most dangerous conflicts of our time unfold. Welcome to Yo African Stories by Frank Asada. Where are you watching from? Before we dive into the possible impact of America invading Iran, we encourage you to rate the video and tell us in the comments below where you are watching from. Like, share, and subscribe so that you will be the first to be notified of our next video coming up. Here's a realistic breakdown. The U.S. is stronger, but ground war is different. The United States clearly has the most powerful military in the world when it comes to technology, air power, naval strength, and global reach. American forces can strike targets anywhere on the planet, deploy aircraft carriers across the oceans, and use advanced intelligence systems that most countries cannot match. In a direct comparison on paper, the U.S. would have the advantage over Iran in almost every category. However, a ground war is very different from airstrikes or naval operations. Fighting inside another country requires soldiers to move through cities, mountains, deserts, and populated areas where the enemy knows the terrain better. Iran's geography alone makes this extremely difficult, with long mountain ranges, narrow passes, and large urban centers that could slow down even the most advanced army. Ground wars also require huge numbers of troops, constant supply lines, and long-term support to hold territory after it is taken. History has shown that winning the first battles is often easier than controlling the country afterward. That is why, even with superior strength, a U.S. ground invasion of Iran will be one of the most complex and risky military operations possible. The United States has a much larger and more advanced military. On paper, the United States has a clear advantage over Iran in almost every category of military power. The U.S. has roughly 1.3 million active duty troops, compared to about 600,000 active personnel in Iran, giving America a larger professional fighting force with global deployment capability. In the air, the difference is even greater. The United States operates over 13,000 aircraft, including stealth fighters, long-range bombers, transport planes, and drones, while Iran has only around 500 to 600 aircraft, many of which are older and less advanced. At sea, the gap becomes even wider. The U.S. Navy has 11 aircraft carriers and hundreds of warships, allowing it to project power anywhere in the world, while Iran has no aircraft carriers and relies mostly on smaller regional naval vessels. Defense spending also shows the scale of the difference. The United States spends hundreds of billions of dollars each year on its military, compared to a much smaller budget for Iran, giving the U.S. a major advantage in technology, training, and logistics. However, even with this overwhelming strength, fighting a ground war inside Iran would still be extremely difficult. The U.S. can dominate in the air and sea, but ground war is different. Because of its size, budget, and advanced technology, the United States would likely dominate the early stages of a conflict with Iran, especially in the air and at sea. The U.S. Air Force and Navy are designed to control the skies and oceans, using stealth aircraft, long-range bombers, cruise missile satellites, and drones to strike targets with precision. In an air war, the U.S. could destroy radar systems, air bases, missile sites, and military infrastructure within days. At sea, American aircraft carriers and submarines could control key waterways and limit Iran's ability to move forces or threaten shipping routes. Precision strikes also give the U.S. the ability to hit specific targets without launching a full invasion, which is why modern conflicts often begin with air and missile campaigns. But a ground invasion is very different from air or naval warfare. Technology alone cannot control cities, mountains, or large populations. Soldiers must physically enter and hold territory, secure roads, protect supply lines, and deal with resistance on the ground. Even the most advanced military can face serious difficulties when fighting in unfamiliar terrain against an enemy defending its own homeland. Iran is one of the hardest countries to invade on Earth. Military experts often point out that Iran is one of the most difficult countries in the world to invade because of its size, terrain, and population. Iran is a huge country, covering more land than Iraq and Afghanistan combined, which means any invading force would have to control vast distances just to move troops and supplies. Much of the country is covered by mountain ranges, including the Zagros Mountains in the west and the Alborz Mountains in the north, creating natural defensive barriers that can slow down or block large military advances. These mountains are filled with narrow roads and passes, making it easier for defenders to set up ambushes or strong defensive positions. There are also very few easy invasion routes into Iran. The borders are surrounded by mountains, deserts, or long coastlines, which limits where a large army could enter. On top of that, Iran has a population of around 90 million people, meaning any conflict could involve not only the regular military, but also reserves, militia forces, and civilian resistance. Because of these factors, many military analysts believe a U.S. invasion of Iran would be one of the most complex and difficult operations in modern history. Mountains favor defenders, not invaders. Mountain terrain almost always gives a major advantage to the defending side, not the invading army. In mountainous regions, movement is slow, roads are limited, and large military vehicles cannot easily spread out or maneuver. This forces invading troops to travel through narrow passes and valleys, where they can be easily watched, blocked, or attacked from higher ground. Defenders who know the terrain can hide equipment, set ambushes, and control key routes with far fewer soldiers. In a country like Iran, where mountain ranges cover large parts of the land, an invading force would have to fight uphill, both literally and strategically. History has shown in many wars that even powerful armies struggle in mountains, because geography can cancel out much of their technological advantage. It would require massive troop numbers. A full ground invasion of Iran would require an enormous number of troops, far more than many people realize. For comparison, the 2003 invasion of Iraq involved roughly 150,000 to 170,000 U.S. troops during the initial phase, with even more forces added later as the conflict continued. Iraq, however, is smaller than Iran, has fewer people, and has less difficult terrain. Because Iran is larger, more mountainous, and has a population close to 90 million, military analysts believe any serious invasion would likely require several 100,000 troops or more to control the country and maintain supply lines. Some past planning discussions inside the U.S. government have suggested that even deployments of over 100,000 troops would not be enough for a full invasion. Right now, the United States does not have that level of force built up in the Middle East. A large-scale ground war cannot start overnight. It would require months of preparation, including moving troops, equipment, vehicles, aircraft, and supplies into the region. Bases would need to be secured, shipping routes protected, and logistics systems prepared to support a long conflict. Such an operation would also require political approval from the U.S. government, cooperation from regional allies, and likely support from other countries. Without that buildup, a ground invasion of Iran would not only be difficult, it would be almost impossible to sustain. Iran would fight differently than Iraq. If a war ever happened, Iran would not fight the same way Iraq did in 2003. Instead of relying only on regular army units, Iran's strategy is built around asymmetric warfare, meaning it tries to make any conflict long, expensive, and difficult for its opponent rather than trying to win in a direct head-to-head battle. Military analysts say Iran has spent decades preparing for this kind of conflict, developing missiles, drones, naval tactics, and proxy forces across the Middle East to counter stronger militaries like the United States. Iran is one of the largest missile arsenals in the region, with thousands of ballistic and cruise missiles capable of striking U.S. bases and allied targets. It has also invested heavily in drones, which are cheaper produced and can be used in large numbers to overwhelm air defenses or attack ships, bases, and infrastructure. Another major difference is Iran's network of allied militias and proxy forces in places like Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Yemen. These groups could attack U.S. troops, shipping routes, or regional bases without Iran fighting alone on the battlefield. Iran could also try to disrupt naval traffic in the Persian Gulf using fast boats, mines, and missile strikes, which would affect global oil supplies and raise the cost of the conflict worldwide. Even if Iran could not defeat the United States militarily, its strategy would be to drag the war out, spread the fighting across the region, and make the cost so high that the conflict becomes politically and economically difficult to continue. What the current situation suggests. Looking at the current military activity and the way both sides are positioning their forces, analysts say the most likely scenario is continued use of air power, naval operations, and limited strikes rather than a full-scale ground invasion. Modern conflicts between powerful countries often begin with air and missile attacks because they allow one side to damage the other's military without immediately committing large numbers of troops. Right now, the United States has the ability to carry out long-range airstrikes, launch cruise missiles from ships and submarines, and use naval forces to control key waterways without sending soldiers deep into Iranian territory. Because of this, an air or naval-focused conflict is considered the most likely outcome if tensions continue to rise. Limited raids are also possible. These can involve special operations forces, small ground units, or short-term missions aimed at specific targets, such as missile sites, military bases, or command centers. These types of operations are very different from a full invasion because they are designed to achieve narrow goals and then withdraw, rather than occupy the country. Military planners often prefer this approach when the risks of a large war are too high. A full invasion, however, would be a completely different level of conflict. It would require hundreds of thousands of troops, months of preparation, and strong political support from both the U.S. government and its allies. It would also likely mean a long and costly war with uncertain results. Because of the size of Iran, its terrain, and the possibility of regional escalation, most experts believe a full ground invasion is unlikely unless the conflict grows much larger and cannot be contained by air and naval operations alone. Most realistic scenarios. Based on current military activity and expert analysis, the most realistic outcomes of AU.EST Iran conflict do not involve a full invasion. Instead, analysts say the situation points toward a combination of air campaigns, special operations, and limited ground actions, rather than an attempt to occupy the entire country. Recent assessments note that U.S. objectives against Iran could be achieved through air and naval power, without mobilizing the massive number of troops required for a full-scale invasion, which would likely need hundreds of thousands of soldiers due to Iran's size and terrain. The most likely scenario is an air campaign, where the U.S. uses aircraft, cruise missiles, drones, and naval forces to strike military targets, missile sites, and infrastructure. This approach allows the U.S. to apply pressure while keeping most troops outside Iran's borders. Recent military deployments in the region, including carrier strike groups and additional aircraft, show that this type of operation is easier to sustain than a ground war. Another realistic possibility is special forces raids or limited operations. These could involve small units entering Iranian territory for short missions, such as targeting weapons facilities, rescuing personnel, or gathering intelligence. Experts say that if ground forces are used, they would most likely be limited to these kinds of missions rather than a large invasion force. There could also be limited ground operations near borders or coastlines, especially in areas close to the Persian Gulf or neighboring countries, where supply lines are easier to maintain. A full occupation of Iran, however, is considered very unlikely unless the conflict expands dramatically, because the size of the country, its population, and its geography would make such a war extremely costly and difficult to sustain. Closing argument. If the United States actually invaded Iran, the war would likely unfold in dangerous stages. First would come an intense air and missile campaign to destroy air defenses, command centers, missile sites, and naval assets. Then the U.S. would likely attempt limited raids or coastal and border operations, testing Iranian defenses before any wider push inland. The hardest phase would come after that, moving troops through mountains, cities, and long supply routes while Iran responded with missiles, drones, militia attacks, and proxy strikes across the wider region. Recent reporting says Washington is still relying on air, naval, and strike options, with no decision yet to send ground troops, even though officials have kept that option open. How long could such a war last? The opening strike phase could last days or weeks, but any real ground campaign or occupation could stretch into many months or even years. Analysts warn that the biggest danger is not the initial invasion, but the long war that follows, securing territory, protecting supply lines, containing insurgency, and managing escalation across the region. That is why many experts see a full invasion as far riskier than an air campaign alone. Who would likely win in the long run depends on what win means. The U.S. would probably win conventional military battle because of its overwhelming air, naval, and technological advantages. But Iran could still make the war so costly, prolonged, and regionally destabilizing that a clear political victory for Washington becomes much harder. That is often the difference between winning battles and winning wars. China and Russia would most likely avoid directly fighting the U.S., but both have already called for restraint and condemned escalation. China has publicly urged an end to military action and a return to negotiations, while Russia has condemned U.S.-Israeli attacks on Iran and warned about wider regional spillover. So the final answer is this. America could invade Iran, but controlling the consequences would be far harder than launching the war itself. Thank you for watching. Please leave comments. Like, share, and subscribe so that you will be the first to be notified of our next video. Coming up,